Hello world, I'm Whitney Bandel and welcome to another video from my HTML and CSS course. In this video we will be looking at CSS layout basics. So let's go ahead and open up our text editor. By default, most elements will naturally span the whole width of the page. In the last video, we looked at having our elements displayed as being block or inline. We used the unordered list navigation in order to demonstrate that you could have elements inline, so that way they could all line up next to each other in the same on the same line. So in this video, we're going to look a little further at div elements. So we've used div elements briefly in previous videos to create containers. The div tag defines a division or a section in an HTML document. Before HTML5, div elements were commonly used to help create common containers that people would use over and over again. Now in HTML5 we have header, nav, main, footer, but before that web developers would use div and then create classes or IDs and give them common names. So div has been around for a really long time and it's been used a lot for grouping together information and then being able to apply styles to it. So we're going to look at how we can utilize those div containers individually and then also within groupings. So in our text editor, let's go ahead and save this. I'm just going to save this to the desktop. And we can call this div.html. We'll start our file the same way that we usually do. You can use your template if you want. Actually, I forgot my comment. For our title, we can just call this div elements. And let's do our styles as embedded. So we'll go ahead and save this for now. And I'm going to use the example from the textbook just because I think it does a really great job of illustrating how the div element works. So in the body section, we are going to create a div. So we'll have a beginning and end tag. And when we have a div, we're going to give it a class or ID that's going to be associated with it. So we're going to create a class. It's going to be called div1. And then inside we'll have some text, and we're not going to put this into element, we'll just have some floating text. This is box 1. And then underneath we'll create a second div, give it a different class name, call this div2. Inside here we'll say this is box 2. Hit save, refresh our page. So right now it just looks like we have 2 lines of text, but they are now stored within this container which has a class associated with it. So we can add some styles. So I'm going to go up here And since these are classes, we're going to start with period div1. Let's do both. So we have div1, div2. So for div1, we'll do width 200 pixels. Height 200 pixels. Background color D1 ECFF. Border 3 pixel dashed 0 0 0 0. Padding 5 pixels. So those are going to be all the styles for the first one. Then the second one, width 100, height 100 pixels, background color FFF, border 3 pixels, ridge 0 0 0, padding 5 pixels, margin 10 pixels. So let's save this and refresh. And so we have different styles on our div containers just so that way we can actually see the difference between them. We can identify them. We could tell already just based off of which order they're going in. So the first one is div1. And here we have the width and height of 200 pixels. Our background color is this light blue color. Our border is this dashed line going around. And then we have a little bit of padding around the text. For the div2, we have the width and height of 100 pixels. Background color is white. The border is black with a ridge. And then the padding is 5 and the margin is 10 pixels. So you'll notice there's a little bit more space around it. So we're going to see what happens when we nest the div containers inside of each other. So it might be a little confusing, but we're going to essentially take this. So you can copy this over or cut it over. I'm going to do Control X to cut. And then after this is box 1, I'm going to do Control V to paste this in. And I'm going to indent this a little bit so you can see. So our original div1 container is going to have the second one nested inside of it. So I'm going to hit save, refresh. Now we actually have this container inside of our first container. So you could use this as a method of organizing your information into columns perhaps and creating complex organizational structures. So we're going to start looking at how we can actually start turning these div containers into structures that you could potentially use to create multiple column layouts. So property that is really helpful is the float property. This is something that you will use in your final project when you are required to create a 2-column layout. So with the float property, you can either specify that your item is going to float to the left or to the right. So we could use this real quick. Let's just add float right to our first div for a second. So you'll see that now this container is going to move over to the right. The default is that it is going to be on the left. So this would just take it back to the old location. We can add float right to our second. And now our box will move over to the side. When you are working with floats, other content will flow around the floated element. Another property that is very useful for working with layouts and columns is the clear property. This is often used to terminate or clear a float. When you are working with the clear property, you can clear left, right, or both. And it's used a lot for footer elements. So let's add a footer to our code and we'll style it so that way it clears. So underneath our div, create a footer, and we can just put your name and date. So right now it's just moving over to the side of the content. Since this is being floated to the left, now it's working as an inline property, and anything that is following behind it is going to end up moving to fill in the rest of the space depending on how large the window is. So if the window gets smaller, then it'll end up stacking. In order to move this content down, we're going to want to create styles for our footer. So here we will write clear. Let's just go ahead and hit both. So now our footer is going to end up going below. So the reason we have a couple of different options for clear, right and left, is maybe we have two boxes like this, maybe one of them's a little bit smaller, and so you could say that you want the footer to clear maybe the height of one box but not the other. This will make a little more sense once we start adding more content. Let's add a few more styles to our footer so we can see it. So we'll do border 3 pixels solid 0, 0, 0 for the color, padding 5 pixels. So here we can actually see what our footer looks like. We're going to take the example from the book and evolve it into a more complex structure. What we're going to do is add a few more semantic HTML5 elements. Let's add the navigation, header, and then we can put this content in the main section. So we can kind of see how everything is going to be pieced together. Let's copy some of these styles into a header. And actually, let's border 3 pixel solid for the header. Let's also do this for the nav. Whoops. Save and refresh. We don't have any content in here right now, so it's just creating a line. So we could just add some filler information. Say this is the header. Link 1, link 2, link 3, save, refresh, and let's actually add some padding to the header and nav as well. Alright, so this is looking a little better already. We might also do text align, right? On the navigation. So our links will be over to the right. For our header, we could add a height, just because we don't have any content right now. Let's try 200 pixels, see what that looks like. It's a little bit tall, let's do 100. It's not too bad. So I'm envisioning that we would have our navigation links up here, maybe an image in the header, or some other content. Actually, we could even go back to having a larger space. Maybe we actually have a hero image, which will be up here. Potentially. So right now we're essentially creating a wireframe. We could even make our navigation taller. Maybe we would want to leave enough space that we could actually have a logo. So we could have maybe a logo button over here and then our links. Hero image here, and then our columns of information and our footer. So I'm gonna actually make this smaller and this smaller so they take up less space when we're working with these columns, because that's what we're really interested in. So we have this first column essentially of information. I want us to actually create a third. So after here, we'll create a div class equals div3. We'll type in this is column 2 and then end it. And then we have this is box 1, this is box 2. Let's add text above this. Let's say this is column 1. We can refresh and then go back to the top. Add style for div 3. Do width 200 pixels. I'm just going to start by kind of copying the styles from the first div, and then we'll go and modify from there. Height 200 pixels. Background color, we can just do the same color for now. D1 ECFF. Border 3 pixel dashed. You could just copy yours if you wanted to. Padding 5 pixels. This time we'll do float right. So it'll float to the right of it. You'll notice that if I resize the window, once it gets to a certain point where they overlap, they'll actually stack over top of each other. It'll still float to the side. But this is a way that we could have 2 columns, and instead of having a fixed dimension, because your final project actually has to be responsive, we could actually change this. Let's change the width and say we want it to be 30% for both of these. Save, refresh. So now both of these columns are always going to be 30% of the page, no matter how large this page is going to be. We still have this box inside of here. So maybe instead we actually have this, where it says this is box 2, maybe we say this is a profile, avatar. So this could be a picture, maybe this is a profile about somebody. We're going to go to Lipsum and get some filler text. So we can kind of see what's going to happen. So we have, this is column 1, this is box 1. We're just going to replace this with some text. And we can actually put this in a proper paragraph now. Save this. Refresh. Looks like we have a bit too much text for what we want. And part of that's because we still have the height and pixels up here. So we can actually remove our height options for div 1 and div 3. We can keep it for 2 right now. So we can kind of see how these elements are going to interact with each other. Maybe we want to actually move our div 2 so it's before our paragraph. So with our div 1, we'll have div 2 nested right at the beginning. The profile picture, it's still going to float to the right. Then we'll have this paragraph description. Maybe this is information about the person. And then you'll see on the right, now we have this spot where there might be this picture profile, and then the text will wrap around to that information. Let's do the same thing over here with the second column. And since this is a class, we can actually just copy everything exactly as it is here. So where we have, this is column 2. I'm just going to highlight this and then I'm going to paste this in to replace it. So we'll have div class equals div 3. We'll have another instance of div 2 inside. We'll have the same paragraph. Hit save, refresh. Alright, so now we have 2 different columns and these 2 are identical, div 3 and div 1. The only difference now is that one floats left and one floats right. And so we can actually change things around a little bit to make it a little bit more optimal with our CSS. So let's create a class called float left, and it will have the float property of left. Here we'll float right, do float right. And what this will do is allow us to remove float left from div 1, and we can completely get rid of div 3. So we can move to our div class div 3 down here and change this to 1. And you can actually apply multiple classes to a div or to anything that you're applying a class or ID to. So if you have an element and you want it to have a class and an ID, you can do that. If you want it to have multiple classes, multiple IDs, you can do that. So we're going to do div 1 float right here. And then up here we'll do div 1 float left. Hit save, refresh. And it looks the same now, except for we are just not having to create kind of multiple containers. So it's up to you how you want to actually divide your classes as you make them. So we could create a style that will have our border and padding. Call it border padding. We say border 3 pixel solid 000. then we could add padding 5 pixels, hit save, and then we could actually remove this border and padding from all these other places that we have it. So that way each of our styles here are going to be unique. And then we could actually just go in here and say nav class equals border padding, header class equals border padding. Don't think I had it on the main section. Go down to footer class equals border padding. Hit save, refresh, and it looks the same. So there's a lot of things that you can do to kind of simplify out the styles that you have and try to condense them. And by doing this, you'll make it easier for yourself. Let's say you wanted to go and change individual pieces of your styles rather than having to go and again kind of rewrite things over and over and over again. Maybe instead of the dash border, we wanted to change this border so it was dotted. Before we would have had to change it on div 1 and div 2. Now we can just go here and change this to dotted. And now all of our columns would have a dotted background. Alright, so next, let's add a little bit more information to our columns. I'm going to go to the heading. And we do have, this is a header. So let's go to the heading style. And let's add text align center. And let's turn the actual header into an H1 so it's more prominent. It's going to be better to have our text actually be in an element anyways. So let's hit save, refresh. See if there's any other styles. We don't have an image to place in here. So what we could do instead, and I'm going to remove the height because we actually want everything to be responsive. We could always add margins or padding if we wanted to. Let's add a color to the background. I'm going to look up that website we were using in the last video for coming up with different colors. Let's practice a different type of color scale. Let's do RGB. We'll do Alright, so in the last video we looked at the idea of creating an outer wrapper, and we can actually go ahead and add one here. So we'll do outer wrapper and leave a place to add styles, and then right under body we'll add div class equals outer wrapper. Then we'll end our div right before the body section. So this will create a container that will hold everything in it. Then we can go up to the outer wrapper styles and add width 75%. This will be something that you will need to do in your homework as well as final project. So this will help create this illusion of the margins on the side and then make our page responsive. We will get to a point where we'll actually break down your style so that way once you make your pages too narrow, that way when you make your pages a certain size, they'll actually resize. Right now, this is kind of comfortable for reading, but once we get to have it be about this size, it ends up being really difficult to read. So we'd want to have a couple breakpoints here to actually change these styles. What I want us to do though is play around with this middle column. I want us to take this paragraph, highlight it, copy it, and see what happens when we paste it right between the end of the second column in the main section. Oops. It's going to try to highlight and indent all of that. Save, refresh. So you'll see that the text ends up filling up everything, ends up filling up the space in between. It'll actually resize based off of those containers. So you could use this as a way of filling in the information. We could also add actually not float, clear. See what happens when you end up clearing. Since they're both the same height, it's going to clear it at the same time. We could remove a sentence or so, the one on the right. So we could see, so clear left is going to act and behave different than if we did clear right. Here we kind of fill in the gap with this information. Clear both would clear just like the footer. So you could actually use this as a way of having maybe some column information act as sort of like a sidebar where you'll have information in between kind of spill down below. It's sort of up to you to figure out how you want these columns and containers to actually behave. I'm going to remove this and refresh, and I'm going to actually add the sentence back to this paragraph so they're identical again. So if we're thinking of this as a page, we will actually want to think about the fonts that we are using. So let's actually go to our styles, and what we can do is create a paragraph style. Do font, family, and just to keep this simple, I'm just going to do sans serif. For our H1, we'll do font, family, serif. So we'll just use kind of whatever the default serif, sans serif fonts are. Do the same thing with our links, which that reminds me we should go back to our navigation and let's replace this just like we did in the last video. So we'll do unordered list. this. I'll just name these link 1 HTML for now. We don't have actual pages for these to go to. Hit save, refresh. Oh, and it looks like I have forgotten my end link tags. There we go. That looks better. Need to add some nav styles. So we'll set nav li to inline. See, what did I add here? Oh. So for nav A, we'll do text decoration and we'll remove the underline. Alright, so your final project is actually going to look at working with a 2-column layout. So I'm going to remove this last paragraph. I just wanted you to see how the clear would work. Hit save, refresh, and let's remove a bit of this text. I'm going to go up to here. Hit save, refresh, just so we can see everything all at the same time. And I'm going to just do some minor tweaks to make this look a little bit more like a wireframe. For example, what we could do is go to the footer, add text align center. For your final project, you'll need to actually create a navigation as well, especially when you're working with mobile. It can be really difficult to scroll through a bunch of information when the page is really long, and so it's really helpful to have a navigation on the bottom as well as the top of your page. So we could actually take our navigation, now that we have it, copy this, and add navigation below. Let's change this to be paragraph. Let's change the copyright date. Save, refresh. And we still have that border. Looks a little goofy in our footer. So this is where we could actually change this. So let's say we want this to just be regular nav. Maybe we want to style this nav differently. We could give this a different class name, this different set of styles. Let's do that. Class equals footer nav. So we can add it here. And we can say text align center. So that way our links are in the center now instead. And we could also do any other changes that we want. Maybe we want these to really stand out and look more like buttons, but we want these to kind of stack up and just be a little bit more subtle. We could do that. Alright, so to make this look a little bit more like a traditional wireframe, let's add in a space for a logo to go. So let's create a div. We'll call this div class equals div4. And inside of this we'll put logo. So we're going to copy the div2 information, but instead we'll change float left to float right to float left. Save that, refresh. Change that to 4. Let's change the height. So it's 150. Give a little bit of room for the logo, the links. Looks like that's also being inherited down here, so we could actually change this. We could say here, maybe we want height 50 pixels. See if we can get this any smaller. Doesn't look too bad. Alright, so that's kind of enough playing around with that. Alright, so the next thing I want to do is actually go to our div1. Let's change this so we're closer to 50 and 50. So we have two columns. We have a little bit of space between them, so that way they're not right up against each other. And then as we resize the window, we'll have plenty of space. So this is going to be closer to what you'll probably have for your final project. Something kind of like this. Alright, next we're going to look at the overflow property, which is used to configure how content should be displayed if it is too large for the area that is allocated. So in order to see this really well, we're going to go to our div1 and we're going to change the height so it's not responsive anymore. And let's say 300 pixels the height. So now we actually have too much information for these containers. So we are going to create an overflow property. And we can choose between visible, hidden, auto, or scroll. So let's choose scroll. Hit save. And now we'll have our information contained within a scrollable space. So we can actually scroll through these. So that way we have more of a fixed layout. This is really common when you would have a fixed layout design rather than responsive, where it's really important for everything to fit within a certain dimension. And so you would use the overflow property in order to contain that information. We could try some of these other options. So visible is the default where it's just breaking out the container. That doesn't look very good. Hidden. So now the information is just gone. That's not necessarily ideal. Auto is just choosing the scroll option. I like this because it doesn't have the scroll on the bottom. So we might just leave this. So I'm going to show you an example of the next property we're going to look at. It's called the box sizing property. And this is the example from W3 Schools. And this can be really helpful when you are trying to take your wireframe idea and actually turn it into code. So when you are thinking about how to divide up your space, for example, I chose 45% for these two div containers. And let's say I had a designer that told me they wanted a certain ratio for how they were going to break up the page. It's helpful for you to have an idea of, do they mean the border area or do they mean the actual content itself? So if we look at the box sizing property, it defines how the width and height of an element are calculated. Should they include padding and borders or not? So here we have box sizing content box, which is the default. Width and height only apply to the content of the element, which should be this area. Then here we have box sizing border box. Width and height apply to all parts of the element, content, padding, and borders. So either option will work. It's just a matter of you knowing which one that you're going to be using, and if you're working with anyone else, that you and that other person are on the same page as you're working. Alright, so we've created a pretty basic wireframe that you could definitely use for your final project. Again, your final project will require you to have a horizontal navigation at the top of your page, and then you'll be required to also have a navigation on the bottom in the footer section. You'll be required to have 2 columns. It's going to be up to you how you are going to decide how you are going to split up your containers and style everything. Next, I'm going to show you how you can create a vertical navigation, and this is actually the direction that your homework assignments is going to go. So we'll take a look at that next. Alright, so for the vertical navigation, rather than messing with the wireframe we've created, let's look at this example from the W3 Schools. And you'll notice that the information is pretty similar to what we've been looking at. Here they have, for the unordered list, list style type none. So that's removing the bullet points. We have the line item links are displayed as a block. So rather than having these as inline where they are next to each other, which causes them to be horizontal, now they are again returning to the next line and stacking on top of each other. And then we have a text decoration here, which is removing the underlines. So here our unordered list looks pretty similar to what we've been working with. And then they have something that's a little bit new, which is looking at pseudo classes. And this allows the styles to change depending on how you are interacting with the links. So the next topic we're going to take a look at is how to configure web pages for printing with CSS. And we're going to look at using different media attributes. There are 3 different types: screen, print, and handheld. And so far what we have been working with has been for screen. We haven't been specifying the media. We've just been allowing the text editor to use screen by default. So let's go up to our head section. And we'll create some links. We'll say style sheet. And then let's say this will be called styles.css. What we're going to want to do is specify media is going to be equal to screen. So if the device that is being used is a screen, then the website will link to this style sheet for the styles. Alternatively, you can do style sheet and then let's link to a page that's called print. Say media equals print. And so what would happen here is we could change some of these styles depending on what would print best. So if we kind of take a look at this page, for example, this green here, this would potentially waste somebody's ink. Maybe this person might want to print in black and white. And so it might actually be better for us to, instead of having a solid color, change this so that way it was maybe just a border. And then this text could be black, and then we could just have white. So they would have the idea of the box container, but without having to use color and without having to worry about this background color kind of bleeding into this white area. It's actually pretty hard to print a colored background with white text on it and not have the color bleed. So that would be something we could do. We could also remove the images, so that way if somebody was printing this, they wouldn't have to worry about the images taking up space. A good example for this is to kind of look at different websites. I like to pick on recipe websites and blogs in general. Alright, so here is a website. This is the Pioneer Woman and a recipe for triple chocolate cookies. And if we look at this page, we'll see that there is a lot of information. There's the social media icons. There's this information over here. One thing I've noticed a lot with blogs like this that have a lot of information is there's a lot of pictures that are really large, so you can see what to do. And then if you're trying to follow the recipe, there's a lot of extra information that you don't necessarily need while you're actually following the recipe. Like here we have, wait, it's Monday, let's just take a moment to enjoy this beautiful sight. We don't really need that. This is helpful. Beat it together. We don't necessarily need this language. It's totes combined, cracking the egg. So some of this is helpful, some of it isn't. I feel like a lot of times there's always some story letting us know what event it's being made for, and here we had boys at our house after church yesterday, and I don't know why I forget just how much food boys consume and so on. So if we go to print, we can take a look at what this website looks like. And usually websites like this that do have recipes do give you alternative PDF versions that you can click and download instead. But I've definitely found sites before that were just blogs, and this was the only option that they provided. So here we have a bunch of text that is overlapping each other. We can't read it. We have a bunch of pictures from other parts of the website, perhaps linking to other recipes. Here we have our big picture, which is taking up a lot of space. We have some information. This looks like the text is actually half on this page, half on the next page. And then, of course, we have pages and pages of comments. So we get to have other people's comments, we get to have links. Actually, it looks like we don't have all of those steps that we were expecting. This is all we have to actually show what the recipe is supposed to be. And like I said, usually there will be some link to another file, but rather than having to actually have a whole nother file, you can create your own style sheet that will instead go and look through the information and optimize it so that way you don't necessarily have to have multiple pages for people to work with. In this case, it might make sense based off of this person's marketing to have this type of narrative description and all the pictures, and then to have the alternative version to download. I've also seen this before with websites that you might be shopping, like an e-commerce site, where we might want to look at a product and find out more information. Maybe we want to print this out. And we'll see that it is kind of changing the styles based off of being printed, but there's a lot of information that's still here that we don't necessarily need on a printed out page. For example, we don't really need to have the sale information that's going on. It's helpful to have this overview. We don't really need these links to customers who also bought. I would expect that the person who might be printing this out might want to just have a picture, description. They might want to have a price. So if they're taking this and trying to compare it somewhere else, they might have that option, or if they're trying to look for an address or something. But again, this is not really the most optimized. And again, we have a ton of filler, reviews, comments. So if you are considering your page, you might think about what sort of information actually needs to be seen. Actually, let's go to the Wikipedia page. Let's see how Wikipedia handles printing. So Wikipedia actually does a really nice job of trying to organize the information and optimize it for printing. So they're expecting that the typical user who is printing the information no longer needs all of these kind of index options or table contents kind of information. So they are just giving you the actual information. We don't have any of the color on the links because we're not actually linking anywhere. You want to be careful of your page breaks and how information is going to end up stopping. So if there is a particular type of information that you need to make sure stops at a certain point, you would want to indicate that it shouldn't continue onto the next page. Here they've made sure that the contents doesn't get broken up. So it goes on to the next page where it's kind of partnered with this information. They're working with different columns to kind of split up information. It does get a little bit messy, like here this continues on. We have our images, but kind of throughout they have sort of this 2-column look, and then it kind of spills over when it can. This looks a little messy, but overall it's not too bad of an experience, and it actually parallels pretty well the content on the screen site. Let's see, we still have our references, which in this case I think makes sense for the content in case somebody was wanting to look up these resources again. And then they have simplified the bottom information and kind of removed the information that wasn't essential. So you want to consider what you may or may not need when you are working with your print styles.